They called her the outsider, the shadow on the margins of the Whitmore dynasty. But through 10 years of being dismissed, she quietly built an empire no one saw coming. This isn't a tale of revenge. This is a reckoning from the woman once excluded from the seat of power, now sitting at the center owning the game. The Whitmore family reunion remained as extravagant as ever, but to Emily the atmosphere had always felt suffocating. The glittering crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings of the Greenwich, Connecticut estate only served to magnify the proud opulence and the condescending glances she had grown far too used to. Standing in a corner of the room, champagne glass in hand, Emily wore a simple black dress, a deliberate choice to render herself invisible within the family's power portrait. But no matter how hard she tried to stay out of the way, Aunt Claudia's sharp gaze found her. "Emily still a secretary at some tiny company, aren't you, dear?" Her voice rang out, tinged with a blend of pity and mockery. Before Emily could answer, Brandon, her cousin, now a partner at his father's law firm, cut in with a smirk. "If you're looking for a real job, I can help. No point wasting time on admin roles with no future." Emily merely smiled faintly, hiding the real curve of her lips behind the rim of her glass, but in her mind every word they spoke etched itself like a cold engraving into memory. They thought she was a failure. They thought she was just a shadow at a party for the chosen few. What they didn't know was that the very person they had dismissed for the past decade was the one holding the keys to the very empire they clung to so desperately. And tonight, Emily's silence wasn't weakness. It was the stillness of someone who knows the moment of truth is drawing near. 10 years ago, in this very house, Emily once brought a thick business plan to the family gathering, full of hope and determination. At the time, she had just graduated from Columbia's prestigious MBA program, carrying with her a breakthrough idea on how to restructure small businesses, the ones barely surviving in a brutally competitive market. She believed her family, with their powerful network and influence in the investment world, would be the perfect launchpad. But instead of encouragement, she was met with half smiles and cold stares. "Consulting, leave that to the big firms. You should start as an assistant like everyone else." Uncle William, who oversaw mergers and acquisitions at Whitmore Holdings, said, without hesitation. Before she could respond, Aunt Claudia cut in, her voice gentle but laced with venom. "In our family, a woman just needs to stay safe and marry well. That's enough." That night, Emily didn't cry. Instead, she quietly made two decisions that would define her entire future. First, she would build her own company without a shred of help from her family. And second, she would make every one of them remember her not through words, but through results. Not long after, in a small Brooklyn neighborhood above an old Chinese takeout joint, the name Black Ridge Strategies was registered as a business. No flashy sign, no million-dollar seed fund, just her, an old wooden desk and a desk lamp illuminating countless sleepless nights. But that place became the starting point of a journey. None of the Whitmore family could have anticipated the journey of a woman once deemed not enough, now quietly building the kind of empire they had never dared to imagine. 3 months before that fateful family gathering, Emily received an urgent email from the CEO of Anders Manufacturing, a long-established production company, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy after a series of supply chain shocks. The major consulting firms had already declined. Investors had turned their backs. They had only one last option: Black Ridge Strategies. Emily didn't hesitate. Over the course of 10 weeks, her team restructured the entire operations system, renegotiated supply contracts, optimized finances, and brought Anders back from the brink into profitability, just as Whitmore Ventures was planning a bargain-priced acquisition. Her family had no idea that the company they were targeting was one of Emily's strategic clients. Even more inconceivable to them was that the anonymous CEO they were preparing to negotiate with was the very woman they had dismissed as the little secretary for over a decade. That morning, on the top floor of Blackridge headquarters in Manhattan, Emily put on a crisp, dark blue suit composed sharp and cold. Her assistant leaned in and whispered, "The Whitmore team is here. They're asking to see the CEO." Emily nodded, stepping into the elevator with a strangely calm demeanor, as though she were simply greeting guests, not about to overturn the power structure of an entire dynasty. The conference room doors opened. Brandon, Uncle William, and Aunt Claudia were seated at the head of the table, radiating smug authority and entitlement. "Where's the secretary?" "We asked for coffee 15 minutes ago," Aunt Claudia snapped. Emily didn't respond. She walked calmly to the opposite head of the table, pulled out a chair, sat down, and looked them straight in the eye. "I no longer bring the coffee," she said, her voice low but resonant. "I'm the person you asked to meet, CEO of Blackridge Strategies." Silence descended like poured concrete. Brandon froze, eyes wide. Uncle William's face turned beet red while Aunt Claudia dropped the pen from her hand. "Is this some kind of joke?" someone stammered. Emily simply smiled, then opened the thick folder in front of her. Inside were numbers, graphs, and documents proving not only was she the CEO, but she was also the one who had quietly dismantled multiple Whitmore acquisition deals over the past 7 years, one by one. No longer the secretary, no longer the outsider, no longer the family's forgotten shadow. For the first time, Emily stepped fully into the light, and that light was so brilliant it left the entire room blinking in disbelief. The boardroom, once so accustomed to the arrogance and exclusive power of the Whitmore family, suddenly felt suffocatingly still. Emily sat upright, flipping through pages of documents as if reading out an indictment, which in truth it was. Every deal, Whitmore Ventures had failed to seize every company that had seemed within their grasp, only to make a miraculous recovery at the last moment, shared one thing in common: Blackridge Strategies. And she had been the one quietly standing behind it all, cutting every wire the empire had tried to use to strangle the market. Summit Pharmaceuticals, Archer Textiles, Indigo Freight Logistics. Emily listed, her voice steady, each syllable landing with deliberate precision. 3 companies you attempted to acquire, 3 companies that returned to profitability within 6 months, thanks to restructuring plans designed by me and my team. William shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. "You're deliberately sabotaging your own family's business." Emily didn't flinch. She met his gaze. "I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm building. I help struggling companies breathe again while you try to buy their corpses cheap and sell off the parts." Brandon tried to interject, his voice strained. "What about loyalty? You're our blood." "Loyalty doesn't mean silence in the face of cruelty," Emily replied, her tone calm but sharp as a glass scalpel. "And if I were truly your blood, I wouldn't be sitting here 10 years later having to fight for a recognition I was never given." Aunt Claudia, no longer able to maintain her usual air of elegance, leaned toward Brandon, whispering something clearly shaken. But Emily wasn't finished. She presented a contract, a strategic partnership agreement between Blackridge and Whitmore Ventures, valid until 5 p.m. today. If they refused to sign, Blackridge would begin purchasing Whitmore shares on the open market piece by piece until it held enough to seize control. This was no longer a threat. It was the truth delivered in the very language they had once taught her: strategy, law, ownership, and power. And now, they were the ones cornered. From the woman who once quietly served coffee in the background, Emily had become the one deciding whether the Whitmore empire would continue to exist under its own name. And the bitterest irony of all was this: they had no choice left but to listen to the very woman they had spent a decade deliberately excluding from every negotiation table. Less than 24 hours after the meeting, Emily's office was flooded with emails and messages from members of the Whitmore Ventures executive board. Those who had once dismissed her at family gatherings were now carefully choosing their words, requesting private meetings, hoping to better understand the strategic partnership proposal they had nearly overlooked. But Emily didn't rush. She knew all too well that regret, when born of lost power, often came wrapped in ulterior motives. Instead of responding immediately, she scheduled a formal meeting, this time at the headquarters of Blackridge, where she would be the one to decide who entered the room and who waited outside in the hallway. And in that meeting, she sat at the center behind a nameplate engraved with the words, Emily Whitmore, founder and CEO. Across from her sat the very people who had once denied her with their eyes, their words, and their biting silence. Now they sat upright listening as she laid out a comprehensive recovery and restructuring plan for Whitmore Ventures, a plan that demanded they abandon old methods, embrace transparency, and place long-term sustainability above short-term profit. Uncle William couldn't hide his irritation. "You plan to change our entire legacy?" he asked, as if clinging to the last fragments of his authority. Emily responded calmly, "I'm not changing the legacy. I'm saving it from those who've run it with arrogance and greed." At the end of the meeting, after all parties had signed the Memorandum of Understanding, William approached her privately in her office. His tone had shifted, no longer angry, but weary. "You could have kept doing all this from the shadows. Why choose to step into the light?" Emily looked him in the eye. "Because at some point the truth has to walk into the light on its own. And because companies like Anders, like Blackridge, and even Whitmore deserve to be led by builders, not just buyers and sellers." A few days later, the financial press began reporting Blackridge strategies, and Whitmore Ventures had officially announced a strategic partnership. Emily Whitmore, the once faceless CEO, was now at the helm of both empires. In the media, some called her the rebellious heiress, others dubbed her the resurrected ghost. But to Emily, the titles didn't matter. What mattered was that real change was happening, no longer hindered by the towering walls her own family had once built. For the first time, she no longer waited for a seat at the family table. She had built her own, larger, stronger, and now the very people who once denied her were waiting to be invited in. A few weeks later, as the media frenzy began to settle, Emily returned to where it all began. The small room above the old Chinese restaurant in Brooklyn, where the name Blackridge Strategies had once been scribbled onto a cheap folder. The old wooden desk was still there, its corner still marked by scratches from the nights she collapsed onto it in exhaustion. But today, as she sat there once more, she was no longer the young woman rejected by her own blood. She was the woman who had built an empire with her hands and quiet determination, and now she no longer had to be quiet. The Whitmore family's year-end celebration was held in an unprecedented location, the main hall of Blackridge headquarters. No more expensive wine on the tables at the Greenwich estate. No more judgmental glances from those perched high above, only solemnity, modernity, and a strangely unfamiliar atmosphere. Respect. As the family members entered, they looked around a space they had passed through before, never knowing who truly owned it. There was no more sneering, no more posturing. They sat down waiting to hear Emily speak. And then she stepped onto the stage. No grand music, no need for accolades or titles. Just a woman standing in the very room she once only dared to linger in the corners of her voice, steady and warm, yet unwavering. "I was once the girl who brought coffee into this very hall, smiling as I was overlooked, nodding as I was ordered around. But that never made me small. It only made me silent so I could listen, learn, and prepare. Because some lessons are clearest when you're on the outside looking in. And when the time came, I didn't need to fight for anyone's seat. I built my own table." The entire hall fell silent. Not from shock, but from recognition that for the first time in the family's history, someone had become the center of it all without needing a title, a favor, or an inheritance. After the event, Emily returned to her office where her assistant had already prepared a cappuccino, the same kind she used to make herself years ago. She picked up the cup and stepped out onto the balcony, gazing at the New York skyline. The sparkling lights no longer symbolized a distant dream, but a testament to what she had created. They once thought her silence was weakness. What they never knew was that silence was how Emily built an empire right beneath the feet of those too busy looking down on her. Some might call it revenge, But to Emily, this was simply justice served just right with a hot cup of coffee perfectly made and at a moment when no one could deny her anymore. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed to succeed and let the truth speak for itself. Emily Whitmore didn't come to ask for a seat at the family table. She came to rebuild the entire table on her own terms. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've quietly fought your battles in silence, leave a comment below. How did you overcome the judgment? What are you building quietly in your own way? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because there are still so many stories left untold, but they deserve to be heard.